Transformative technologies, also referred to as disruptive technologies, are innovations that significantly alter industries, markets, or societal norms. They often displace established practices or products, thereby introducing new ways of doing things. Leveraging the power of these technologies to revolutionize education for national growth is a focus on this segment. And my guest, Luktolo Hubush, Group Managing Director, Education Division, Adapt IT, will share insights with us. Mr. Hubush, thank you so much for joining us on Insights.
Thank you for having me.
And I hope I got your name correctly. Could you pronounce your name?
It's pronounced Luktolo Hubush, but you tried very well, and I give you credit for that. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. Now, let's begin with smart digital teaching and learning technology solutions. How are we Africans leveraging these solutions? Because most nations within the continent are still grappling with severe political issues. So adopting these technologies look too far for us. And why is it so?
Thank you so much. I think you make a very important combination. One, it is the role of government and the extent to which that role assists education broadly, higher education for us in particular. We have seen and we know that on the African continent, interestingly, where most of the money does go, it goes to, amongst others, education. And that will typically refer to basic education. And we have seen a focus on that also trickling into higher education. And the key consideration, firstly, is how to widen the net to bring as many of these young people into the education space. The second challenge that governments do have is ensuring that those that enter education remain in education and are able to graduate. The other element of that, coming to answer your question, is that those that graduate, they then begin to have a challenge of finding employment that can sustain themselves. So that's the first broad challenge that I think the state has. Linked with that also, it is the cost of education, particularly higher education. So questions of efficiency then begin to come to effect and begin to really have a weight in terms of the decisions on the allocation of resources for the state. And when we now begin to speak about disruptive technologies, what we have seen, particularly with the advent of COVID in 2019, there was a serious focus to say, how does the world, broadly speaking, and Africa in particular, respond to what was a clear shift in providing education? Traditionally, it has been face-to-face or in-person, and during COVID, it moved full swing, 180, to then go into online. Institutions now have settled into what is called hybrid modes of learning. That has brought challenges, but it has also brought a number of opportunities into the sector. And I must say that Africa, in fact, has got very deep penetration of digital teaching and learning technologies.
Okay, let me come in then.
Yes.
And now, with digital transformation accelerating changes across Africa, how is technology fostering innovative learning approaches, particularly emerging markets like, let's say, for example, West Africa?
Yes.
Like you mentioned, tertiary students in tertiary institutions are still having these issues because by the time they leave school, accessing these technologies is a problem.
Yes. If one looks at the key epochs within an institution of higher learning, the first one is about how do you enable access, and I'm now underlying that with education, with technology. Okay. So the first key aspect is how do you provide access for students. The second one is how, once they are in the institution of higher learning, they are able to learn and learn effectively with the use of technologies. And disruptive technologies then have assisted us with the following. The first is that you have got portals, and now these are also available via mobile devices, where students themselves can apply online. They can also register online without having to set foot on campus. Another component of that, which is a big frustration for many in higher education, has been the question of how do they get accommodation for those institutions that provide accommodation. How do they manage funding from third-party donors? So you now have got technologies that are able to assist with regards to the applications and the registrations process. If you look, for example, on private higher education institutions, one of the key considerations for them is how do they identify students that are able to pay, because those payments obviously are quite key. And we've got technologies that are able to facilitate that, that integration with payments directly to the banking sector, for example. The other one, just by way of interest, has been how do you verify that if you are registering students here, for example, in West Africa, in Nigeria in particular, that they are a citizen of Nigeria, and that for that matter, they are entitled to some of the financial assistance that the state does provide. So linking that to your own database from a Home Affairs point of view, or your Department of Interior, begins to be important. For those that may be said to be indigent, you then want to link to your SARS database, with your revenue database, so that you can verify that they indeed are students that are in need, and they don't have parents maybe that would be able to afford to pay for them. Just by way of examples, yes.
Okay. Now, you know, in Nigeria, we have the Student Loan Fund,
yes,
where students access fund for their education. Now, from your own perspective, what are the most important skills educational institutions can adopt to maximize the advantages of ongoing edu-tech revolution?
Thank you so much. This is actually one of the key benefits. Africa invests quite heavily in education. In South Africa, for example, we have what we call the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, and we're a key aggregator of their information. One of the key dependencies there is how do you ensure quite early enough. In fact, many of them, I would say, Namibia has got NSFAF, Tanzania has got Higher Education Student Loans Board. And one of the critical elements in there is funding students that are in need. And how do you verify that the students that you are funding indeed are in need of funding? Because obviously there are limited resources. And that is where then the verification and the integration with other state-owned sources of information allows us to be able to confirm that the student that is applying for funding, indeed they are in need. The other one that is quite key is that there is a dependency for this student loan board on the work that is being done by the institutions themselves. And what do I mean? One, we must verify that the student that we are funding qualifies to enter the academic program.
That's true.
And for that, there must be feedback that goes back to the student loans board. The other element is you find students applying in multiple institutions, and therefore they may be funded for those institutions or for multiple sources, thus then reducing what would be the available pool of funding. The other element that is important there is when students, they will start with one course and then they will change during the course of the year.
Yes.
But the fees that are paid for those courses may be different. For example, a student may come in to do a Bachelor of Commerce and change maybe from that to do engineering, and the courses are different. So you find that they may have been funded for one quantum initially, but now the needs of the institution have changed, and therefore they need to have a different set of funding. The flow of that information between the institution as well as the Student Loans Board is one of the critical success factors in the administration of the funds. Last but not least is the ability of those students to pay back. And how does the Loans Board here in Nigeria track those students that were funded, ensure that they are working, and ensure that what they are earning in salaries is sufficient for them to be able to refund the Loans Board, and then obviously create a space where other students can get that funding. There is firstly a delay in the time between when a student does graduate and when a student is able to find employment.
Okay.
And when they do find employment, then the question begins to be whether or not in that employment they are earning enough to be able to pay the student the loan. And what also then happens in reality is that a lot of these young people, by the time they get employment, so between graduation, let's say employment, the student sits for a year, maybe 2 years, they actually owe not only the Student Loans Board, but they've got debt owing to a number of other areas. For example, they would have needed to survive in terms of having a place to stay. Many of them, they have to leave their original homes and go into cities to try and find work. All of that adds up on their own cost. And by the time they find employment, they must still take care of the most basic needs before they can pay back to the Student Loans Board. So that's the very first challenge. Then the second one that they have to contend with is that now they must start to pay back, but how does the loans board track and keep track of those that are earning enough so that they can pay them? But also you don't want to snuff out the ability of the student to survive because now they have to pay what would be an onerous amount of money back to the loans board. And many of us, I'm happy to say, we have what some call black tax, but essentially because we live in a communal arrangement, we would have been assisted by a sibling or two to go through to an institution of higher learning. And once we graduate, there's an expectation that we are going to assist other members of the family.
Of course.
So the payment back on the student loans board is balanced against other needs and obligations that a student does have. But from a government point of view, the ability to track those students and determine what the threshold is for them to be able to pay back.
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
In what ways would you be helping our tertiary institutions and their TVETs develop robust and sustainable digital learning infrastructure?
Yes, the first thing that we've done just on that, we have said we have got a collaboration model.
Okay.
And that collaboration model first looks at what IP may have been developed by a certain institution that we're able to scale. Number two, we've looked at how do we co-create solutions with institutions. Then when it comes to digital teaching and learning in particular, that digital teaching and learning is critical for purposes of how do we get a student to be appropriately accommodated and registered. I'll give you a sense in terms of what our system does have. Most of the automation that is required in institutions of higher learning, it rests on what we call the academic structure. And that academic structure essentially is a replication of the prospectus that an institution has. And linked with that, it is, for example, the rules for promotion. It is the weighting that is required. And we're able to automate that such that a student can move from 1 year on to the next year.
Okay.
Also to help in terms of identifying those that are eligible to graduate. And obviously, and you'll see that there's a big impact in terms of certain vocations because you can actually use now artificial intelligence to mark a paper. A task that used to take days or even
weeks,
hours can be done in a matter of minutes because there is an application of artificial intelligence. Another big element has been the extent to which learning itself is aided by these technologies. And here I'm just talking about artificial intelligence. Another one maybe I may cite with the time that we have is what is now called agentic AI. And what it does do in particular is that you don't have to be a computer science graduate to be able to develop programs or code. Perhaps one that is also worth mentioning in the space that we are in is how to authenticate documents. And there's technology now where you can see the QR codes in terms of giving access to venues, verifying documents that are also quite key in the process of applying these FIRE technologies. The other challenge that we have seen is that a lot of young people study and graduate with a piece of paper, but with no core skill and concrete skill. And to that extent, I would encourage very much entrepreneurial approaches, partnerships with corporates that are here, so that in those internships, young people can begin to learn how to create proper solutions that in themselves they can use. And we've seen some very interesting businesses even within institutions of higher learning by younger people who have been able to blend those two schools of thought. Thanks.
Luktolo Hubush, Group Managing Director, Education Division, Adapt IT. I want to thank you so much for joining us on Insight, and thank you for enlightening us. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I truly appreciate it, and I've had a wonderful time here in Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
And that's it on this episode of Inside. Do join us same time next week for more on the program. My name is Nnamdi Adigbo.
And I'm Elizabeth Omori. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.